Thank you for coming to the 2022 Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Now, please welcome to the stage Jim Rutledge, also a member of the inaugural 2001 class of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, to introduce this year's recipient of the Parker Beam Lifetime Achievement Award, the late Stephen Francis Thompson, who is founder and president of Kentucky Artisan Distillery.
I also want to thank Jeremy Deaver and Paul Tomaszewski, not Tomaszewski, but for working so hard and putting so many hours in making sure that Steve was nominated and receiving this prestigious honor. And it's an honor for me being here. I was asked just to, rather than talk about his past accomplishments, which are so many, but just to tell some of the stories about Steve that endeared him to all of us in the industry. When he finished up his project in Hawaii, got back to Kentucky, he was wanting to stay in Kentucky. He didn't have the money at the time to start a distillery. So Steve's always thinking out of the box, and he was looking at the rail industry and thinking of all the commuter trains and big cities, the trains that you can catch from Boston to New York, Washington down to Atlanta, or from LA to Chicago and back. But he said one thing they all have in common are the toilets. He started his first company was RF Industries, which made toilets for the rail industry and repaired the ones that weren't working properly. And I was always, what does RF Industry have to do with that? But RF was for Royal Flush. But there were so many stories about Steve going for hours and hours. It was a few years ago, I had a meeting down in Vendome with Mike and Rob Sherman, and prior to the meeting, Rob and I started sharing Steve stories. And Rob was saying how they could often walk around or hear that somebody's wandering around their plant outside or maybe even inside looking at equipment, and they would find Steve, and he was down there just looking for something that Vendome might be able to give to him so he could maybe use in his distillery. But when Steve built his distillery, and he was very innovative and thinking out of the box, and he would collect equipment, tanks, vessels, pipes, whatever, anywhere he could get it, and he didn't spend much money, if any, on the distillery, the equipment when he started. And Rob was laughing and talking about the story that his stills, his mash tub, which is a cooker, the fermenters, nothing is in sync. The still was larger than the capacity of the cooker. The several fermenters he had, nothing was the same size. He would just find these parts. And they said at Vendome they had nicknamed him the Frankenstein of distillation. He just grabbed the parts and he would make it work. It was just a few years ago. If you knew Steve, you would often hear him saying, well, if you dress like you don't have much money and you buy something, you can probably get a discount, or even better, get it for free. And that's why he was walking around Vendome. But he was also, just a few years ago, he picked up 5 800-gallon stainless steel with copper steam tubing in it, cookers that were used by a tomato canning plant, which is just not too far from his distillery. He brought them all back, and he didn't know how he was going to use them. He didn't have room for 5, maybe just one more tank in his distillery of some kind. Originally, he thought he was going to make use it for a cooker, a second cooker to supplement what he already had. He later changed his mind. He says, I think I want a still, combination pot still, column still. I've always wanted that. So he decided to take this vessel to Vendome, have them put a flange and a column on it, and he'd have the still he'd been wanting. So one very cold, Jeremy tells me, it was very extremely cold December morning. Steve and Jeremy packed up, loaded up the still, took it down to Vendome, and on the way, as they were approaching the Vendome copper, Steve spotted a forklift driver in the driveway of the plant, and he got his attention real quick and said, hey, we need to unload this tank here. We're gonna have some work done on it. And the guy said, well, I've got to get hold of Rob, make sure my boss is okays this. And Steve said, oh, I've already talked to Rob. He knows everything about it. And he even brought it up again later. And he says, I've talked to Rob. He knows exactly what we're going to do. And so the guy finally unloaded it. As soon as they got the tank off in the middle of the driveway of Vendome, Steve and Jeremy jumped back in their truck and headed back to Crestwood and the Kentucky Artisan Distillery. And about 15 minutes on the way back, Steve makes a phone call. And he says, hey Rob, this is Steve Thompson. I just want to let you know I just dropped a tank down there. I want you to make a still out of it, and I'll need it by April, 4 months from now. And of course Rob was caught off guard. That's the first time he had heard about this. And so Rob called him a little bit later, a couple days later, to talk about it. He said, I've looked at your tank. We can cut the hole in the top. We can put a flange and a column on it. We can get it done, but we're really busy now. And we can probably get it done by June. And Steve says, that won't work. I need it by April. I don't know why he needed it by April. He just wanted it by then, I think. But again, Rob says, we can't get this done in 4 months. Well, Steve says, well, in 4 months from now, I'm going to have the money to pay for it. If you wait till June, I'm going to be broke again. So if you want to get paid for the job, you need to get it to me in April. And Vendome delivered the still completed in April. Our business is, distillery business is very hard one to get into. You know, if you get the money, once you have the funds, and you have property, you do some land preparation, you buy the equipment, you build a distillery, and all the tankage in and out. It could take 1.5 years to 2 years to get things started. And Steve, if you've been around, well, just one of the stories, it's so difficult because for the first, you get 2 years, then you're filling the barrels, aging those barrels. So takes about maybe 5, 6 years, maybe 7 years before you can get some money coming in. So a lot of the distilleries, and most of them probably, contract distill for other people who, or they start a bottling operation to contract with other people to fill the bottles. And so Steve decided, or they decided, needed some money to have a small bottling operation. And whether he was, they were distilling on contract or bottling, he would always tell the people he was negotiating with, you can get the price, you can get the deal, but you can't get both. And he was talking to, I think, a guy from eastern part of the U.S. For a bottling contract, and the gentleman wanted him to bottle some aged rum, some relatively young rum, and they finally made a deal. It was going to be a 3 to 4 year old rum, and after some time, a month or so, after the bottles were and the supplies, the bottles, the labels, the closures were all in the plant, then they had to get the rum. When the rum arrived, it was clear, unaged rye. So rum. And Steve called the guy and said, how was that rum you wanted us to bottle? And the guy said 3 to 4 years old, so very light color. And Steve says, well, we've got some caramel on hand. And if we mix just the right amount of caramel, we can get you a rum that looks like it's 3 to 4 years old. And so the guy finally agreed to do that. So Steve gets out his calculator, goes through a bunch of calculations, calculating how much caramel they need to add to this volume of rum to make it look 3 to 4 years old. So they did it. When it was all blended, at the end of it, they looked at it and something was wrong. And so he called the gentleman back and said, what was that age again you wanted the rum to look like? He said 3 to 4 years old. He said, well, I just made you a premium 8 to 10-year-old rum, so do with it what you want. That was Steve, but you know, the distillery, I remember the first time I saw what he was going, he just had all the equipment in the distillery. He hadn't started putting it all together yet. He asked me to come out and just take a look at it. And he started explaining this, how he was going to make this tank, a cooker, this was still, this might be a second still, and nothing matched. It was just all stuff he'd gotten, mostly free. And, but Steve was a genius. He was able to make things work. An example of that, one of our brands, Cream of Kentucky, we've had a few runs. I've been retired for 7 years, semi-retired anyway. But we've had a few runs of Cream of Kentucky bourbon. And this past year, last year, we decided to, let's try Cream of Kentucky rye. And so we purchased some rye, a whiskey. We bottled it 100 proof, bottled and bond, estate straight rye whiskey. We gave a bottle to Fred Minnick for his Ascot Awards this year. Ended up winning double platinum. And the point here is that the whiskey we used was distilled, aged, and bottled by Kentucky Artisan Distillery. And that's what Steve could do with the equipment he had. So I'm very proud to be up here again to introduce Steve to the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Steve's family up to take a back.
I'd like to thank, in honor of Stephen's children, Sherry, Katie, Paul, and Stephen, who sacrificed lots of weeks and times without their dad as he traveled throughout the world developing his craft. They sacrificed a lot by not having their dad for special things like soccer games and things like that. And also his former wife, Vicki, who held down the fort almost like a single mom for many times when Stephen was out working and developing his craft and supporting the industry. So I just want to acknowledge how important it is for all of us to remember that it's the families that are the groundwork and the core of why we are able to develop any kind of occupations or professions that makes our world a better place. And then Stephen's dream was always to develop his own distillery. There were some other hard-working people, Jeremy, Ricky, Chris, and Jade. Chris and Stephen spent 12 hours at a time creating this dream that he had, and also his professional support from Richard Schiller and other people who helped him financially, Roy Schwartz. Thank you.
with Kentucky Artisan, please stand so we can acknowledge y'all. And you're wearing your wine shirt today. Great, Chris. Thank you.
Weep no more, my lady. Oh, weep no more today. We will sing one song for my old Kentucky home, for my old Kentucky home.